There we go. Hey, we got
Test. Am I
yeah,
on
we
there?
got sound now.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Um, hey Tanya, so Tanya, we're back. We've been gone. We've been gone for about 3 weeks.
Been a lot of water under the bridge in the
Lots of
last
water
month.
under the bridge. I guess the first Friday we missed was the Friday after Eli passed away, and so I want to thank you all for all your prayers and cards and comments during the last couple of weeks that we've been dealing with that, and then we had funeral and family in, I guess, 2 weeks ago, and then just couldn't get to it. But we're back today. If you're out there watching, Tanya has commented, let us know you're watching. It means a lot to us. It actually does. We're pretty emotionally sensitive, or at least Tim is, and we like to know you're out there. But just kind of want to catch up a little bit.
On a housekeeping note, if it sounds buzzy in the background, somebody send us a note.
Yeah, we got a fan going on it. If you haven't noticed, I'm a big dude and I like air flowing. So if it's bothering y'all, just somebody, hey, sounds funny. But yeah, it's just been a crazy few weeks. I've got a lot of things swirling around in my mind. I mean, we're going to continue with First Corinthians today. We're going to talk about the Lord's Supper and some things like that. But been a lot of conversations been had, with the stuff, our family's been through and that kind of stuff. And it's interesting to me, and I guess noteworthy, that in the middle of just abject tragedy, it's when the Lord really pulls you in tight. And we talk about that all the time, that he's near the brokenhearted and all that stuff. And it's kind of words on a page, but when you're walking through it, it's so real. And it's been horrible, but it's also been good in the sense that the Lord's been close, and he's actually used it as an opportunity to reveal some things about him, and stuff we talk about all the time. And I'll just throw this out there because it's germane to our conversation about the Lord's Supper in First Corinthians. In that, when I was preparing Eli's service, we have this bend in us when someone passes away, and we do it even before they die, that we're trying to figure out, are they in, are they out, are they saved, are they lost? And I get that. I mean, because I was in that space even with Eli, and because worldly speaking, and I guess this is really true for almost anybody, if you want to find a reason to say that they're not saved, you can find it.
Well, how would you define just the typical manner, whether somebody's saved or not? How would you define that in terms of what their actions?
Now or before?
Well, before.
Because I would do it
at a base level. I mean, I know what I think they are, but you actually said it here a little while back to somebody else. I was listening. I'm interested to see how you put that.
I guess previous to this event, I'm always looking for, we would say for fruit. By their fruit they shall know them. The problem with that is we like to define what fruit is. And we define human fruit. Are they active in church? Are they carrying their Bible? Are they doing all these things? Are they in prayer? Are they doing the disciplines? And not that those don't have merit, because they do.
Well, they do.
They have absolute, I mean, they're extremely important. Are they salvific necessarily? I don't know. Because, I mean, what was it, a couple years ago when the Southern Baptists came out, or a year ago, whatever it was, came out with their study, you got these guys that have been pastors and walking, doing the deal, doing study, doing visitation, having prayer meetings, preaching on Sunday, and actively abusing and molesting children. And the same kind of question came up then. What was the guy's name? He's passed now.
Ravi Zacharias.
Ravi Zacharias, had this, after he died, this huge controversy. Things came out, and a lot of people, what in the world, and what the Lord gave me well, let me back up. Early in my Christian walk, I struggled with whether or not, constantly struggled with, am I actually saved or not?
Yeah.
Part of that was the tradition I grew up in, not the home that I grew up in. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but some of the religious tradition that I grew up around, not even necessarily in, but just some of the people that I ran around. And so I was just constantly, well, I screwed up today. I had a really bad day, and I'd go to bed at night thinking, I'm toast, I'm gonna fry. And I would get saved again, oh, please don't take me to hell. He's saved me again, or whatever it takes. And man, it's exhausting. But I remember my mom told me, and maybe this is what you're talking about, and because I repeated this the other day, it makes more sense to me now. She would always tell me, and I kind of thought it was trite. I just chalked it off as trite, but I'm seeing now that it's got some depth to it. And that was, if you're worried about it, you probably shouldn't be worried about it. Is that what you were talking about?
No, that actually works here. But no, just the simple disciplines of, well, if you're really saved, then you spend a lot of time studying in your Bible, you're active in your church, you do all these things. And I would agree with a lot of that. But that is not the measure by which you can base God's working through you as an individual that belongs to him. We announce that he belongs to him whether you're saved or not. So as an example, in James chapter 1, I think it's verse 24-ish or something like that, it talks about to receive the word that's been implanted.
Right.
Well, traditional thinking would tell you, and I'm not here to make an argument point, but a lot of theological type people would say, well, that can only happen once you've been saved. And I don't see it that way. I see it as an eternal function, that it was implanted in you because you're created by him. Everything about God is, you carry his DNA, so to speak, in you, whether you're saved or not. But there comes a point where he's going to approach you, so to speak, and reveal himself. And you're not going to know all the depths and ins and outs and disciplines and all that kind of stuff. But you go, yeah, you are real. I'll take that.
Right.
Confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead and you will be saved. I mean, so my point is that you said that I used to think that, if you're a real Christian, you're really saved and those things, you read your Bible, you go to church, you're involved in all that. And you were struggling with, Levi had a conversion time and that kind of stuff, and you've been worrying about that. But then, and I may be stealing some of your thunder here, but one of the things you learned through this experience is you saw how God was touching people eternally.
Right.
Through him. And I don't think it's even worth going back and going, okay, well, did that happen when the conversion spirit happened past that or not? And the whole point of our whole ministry here is how does God really do things? And we don't have to know all of those things, but I would tell you he was touching people through him in an eternal sense.
Well, and that's really what the things that hit me, standing there doing Eli's service, was the sheer number of people, not just that were there to pay respects or even for our support, which was I was blown away. But the sheer number of people that this young guy had impacted, and it had more than just friendship. The things that we were hearing and the things people were saying and have since then even, were eternal type. They were even using eternal language. It talks about, in the scriptures talks about the Gentiles who have the law in their hearts.
Yeah.
It was that sort of a thing. People who were not even professing active believers, but I was hearing things like the impact that was had was on an eternal level. Showed me what love was about, showed me what loyalty and friendship was about, compassion, all of these sorts of things, and it was just like, wow, and I always like to say that God can draw really straight lines with pretty crooked sticks. And and that's all of us.
Well, and so you talked about fruits earlier. Well, how do you define fruits? Well, we hadn't got to that point in Corinthians yet, but there's a place in there where he says, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And so we immediately hear those words and we go, oh, I know what those are. Well, you do know what they are to a certain level, and you also know them deeper than what you think you know them, but yet we define them.
Right.
This is what it has to look like if that's what it is. And that's for us to be able to have some semblance of grasp. And so then we'll superimpose, well, that's how God meant it.
Right.
But in like the example that you're talking about, and this goes directly with how I think Paul was talking to this church in Corinthians,
Yeah.
is that you're able to see that God's definitions, or the eternal definitions of what those things are not bound up in some function that we're either thinking we're outside of that or we're in it and the other person needs to be like that. We can't even fathom what that stuff is because the Bible tells us we can't grasp the depth and the level of God. We can see it and we can experience to a certain degree, but trying to take it so that we can encapsulate, know exactly how he's going to do it, where he's going to do it, and why he's going to do it, can't be done.
No, and now it's been one of the things that I've struggled with, Tim. I've been doing ministry for 29 years. It'll be 30 years in August, and actively pursuing ministry, not just my walk with the Lord, but pursuing ministry. And I'm wired in such a way that I want to be relevant, I want to be impactful, I want what I do to matter, and that's not just spiritually; it's just across the board. I don't want to be insignificant in my being. And so that gets translated in the ministry of, okay, so now I'm looking for my ministry, my walk with the Lord to be impactful and, to have meaning and purpose. And I want the Lord we would say things like, I want the Lord to use me in a mighty way. That's what we say. But immediately when we say and feel or even think those things, we start thinking about, well, then what's that going to look like? How am I going to know when I'm there? We have this innate bend to put metrics on things, to measure things. I'm willing to strive, but I want to know where the finish line is.
Yeah.
And in my thinking, the finish line would, how does a minister gauge effectiveness? And this really translates to anybody that's pursuing the Lord and trying to make disciples, but particularly somebody in the ministry. Well, we immediately start putting things in there like, well, your church is growing.
Yeah.
Or I sat in a revival service years ago, right down the road here at Walnut Springs. Probably shouldn't have said that out loud. But anyway, there was a guy there, and it was one of the most, I think, spiritually abusive moments in my life. And he was an evangelist they brought in, and one of the things he said, I remember on a Sunday morning, he said, if somebody's in the ministry and they're not leading 30 people to Christ a month, they're not worth their salt and they're probably not even saved. And you should fire them.
That's a simple metric. That's a human effort to put out on top of something like that.
Right.
And you know what? We're all going to go through those things, and God uses those things because you can sincerely do something like that and be wrong.
But sincere.
And learn your lesson later.
Yeah.
And as long as you're learning, that's what the Lord's looking for. But we're going, but I have to do it right or I'm going to screw up all this stuff. And even Paul has used that language.
Yeah.
He said, if you do this stuff, you're going to jack up their entire lives. I have to read that over and over again because I'm trying to figure out, and maybe he was just having an emotional moment when he wrote that.
Well, but
I'm not saying it's not true.
But it's a good interjection that Paul was just a guy.
He was.
And I think as we walk through 1 Corinthians, for me, it was extremely helpful, even going in dealing with Eli's death, to remember that even the Apostle Paul was just a man. And dare I say, y'all don't give me any emails because hear my heart in this, according to Hebrews, that Jesus in his own humanity, outside of his deity, had to learn obedience through what he suffered. And that's Hebrews 5, I believe, or it's either 5 or 8. And he struggled the night before the crucifixion in his flesh. Hey, let's do this a different way. And we see Paul writing things like, if by somehow I persevere and make it. I mean, this is the Apostle Paul using language like, if perhaps I am saved, if perhaps I can persevere. It's the same guy that writes Romans 8, Romans 9, who's talking about election and all this stuff, and so it's the same guy, but he's also just a man dealing with these emotions, and it's the same stuff. Am I being effective? Am I doing it right?
Yeah.
And the more that I study, the more that I go, one of the things that really hit me the last couple of weeks was what you said. We can't know what God's doing ultimately. We might see pieces of it. But what we can do is trust that he is doing something.
You can trust that he's doing it. You said something a while ago. I'll see if I can remember what you said. You said that talking about you quantifying. I've been in the ministry. I've done these things, but you said you had a separation there where you said not just with my walk with the Lord, but my ministry. Well, no, but that's what and that's where I would tell you that what God is looking for, and what even Paul's telling these people right now, forget about your ministry.
Right.
It's about pursuing the Lord and whatever that ends up looking like. And I don't mean, you're out doing weird stuff and all that. I'm talking about as you're pursuing him and gaining understanding based off how he works in somebody else and those kind of things. Those are things you begin to see after a while. You would have never guessed what you saw in some place, and you see it, but you know it's eternal. And you have to learn to accept that. We've talked about it 400 times, but the ministry that I'm involved with down at Way of the Cross is just an example on that. I can take a herd of people down there that have been in ministry all their lives. I'm not talking about, white suit wearing, red Bible carrying, not that extreme. But people that are in ministry and they're going, and this is how you begin to get this. It just happens. This is how it's supposed to be. I can take them down there and drop them in the middle of that thing. And y'all don't know all this. He does. But it's a ministry that you'd look at and you just about be disgusted in what you saw. Not because they're doing anything weird stuff, but I mean,
the disorganization.
It's disorganized.
It's not polished.
It ain't polished on any measure whatsoever. The facilities could be seen as broken down. They're really not. But just all that kind of stuff. But the one thing when you walk out of there you can't deny is, man, the fruit that gets produced out of this crazy thing is unbelievable. And I've been with him for 25 years. And I'm always amazed at the people that walk out of there and they'll separate themselves from them, not violently or any of that kind of stuff. It's just because they don't want to comprehend that God works in something that looks like this. And it's probably because they think he might call me into something like that.
What if he wants me to stay? And that was exactly one of the things that hit me during Eli's service was just, like I said, the sheer numbers and level of impact that Eli had through his life and that I would have never seen, never known, never understood. I wasn't looking for it like that. But we've made, dare I say, some kingdom connections since then with some people, doing some follow up and trying to minister to some folks with a direct correlation to their impact and relationship with him. And it really caused me to step back and say, I'm probably never going to figure all this out. And that's where, honestly, it can get sinful in my own heart, is the need to figure it out. It's also an evil taskmaster. And the end of 1 Corinthians 11 can be that way. What does this have to do with 1 Corinthians and the Lord's Supper and all that? It's really easy for us a lot of times to get so bound up in the way it ought to be done, the way we think it ought to be done. And then we'll go get a verse of scripture to kind of back it up. But Tim was making a point before we got started that really 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 are like the only places in the New Testament that speak about the methodology and all of that of the Lord's Supper, what we would consider the Lord's Supper.
Well, how we see it and deal with it in the church now.
Yeah. Almost all of the other references to it are throwbacks to the actual Last Supper, the Passover, that they would be doing.
Not that you should do this.
Yeah, it's just kind of a statement of fact more than it is a prescription of duty. And
that's not to say we shouldn't do it.
Don't run away with that. But as I was preparing Eli's service and was thinking about, you said, talking about fruit, I asked myself, is there any fruit? And then I started asking the question, what kind of fruit am I looking for? And you can look for earthly fruit and there will be some in a lot of, I mean, you look at somebody's been faithful to the ministry, faithful to a church, faithful to a relationship. There is fruit, tangible, directly correlative fruit. But I was looking for eternal fruit. And I just went to the fruits of the Holy Spirit. And like, did I see any of these things? And went down the list, and I believe the Spirit, gave that. And it was an encouragement to me that fruit can be found if you're looking for it.
Yes.
In almost everything. You can also find a lack of fruit if you're looking for it. And I can look in the mirror and go all day long, Matt, you're not doing this, and this, or you're not doing it well. It won't take me 15 seconds to get down that road. It's a whole different matter to let the Lord look at me through the mirror and say, but here's what I'm doing in you. That's harder. And as we've been talking through the 1 Corinthians this whole time, that I don't know that I've ever heard, especially these latter chapters of 1 Corinthians, discussed from the pulpit or whatever, except for in terms of here's how you do things.
Yeah.
Here's how you do tongues, here's how you do gifts, here's how you do the Lord's Supper, and by golly, you better be careful. And the more we study and the more we dig, the more the Lord reveals of himself to me and around me and in spite of me. The more I'm seeing that it's way less prescriptive, way less, here's your check marks. And what really threw me, we've been saying it, but it's important, it's germane, is when Paul would say, well, this is the Lord saying this, and I'm like, okay, there's me an anchor. But then he would say, this ain't the Lord, it's just me. Or when we got into head coverings a few weeks ago, and he's like, well, you can do it or you cannot do it. Depends on your situation. It's utterly frustrating to me. Yeah. If I'm approaching it as give me the check boxes. And the same is true when we get into the Lord's Supper, as we look at this thing and we start wanting to put check boxes on it. But if we'll be critically and think critically, the way that we do the Lord's Supper, the little cup, the little piece of bread, whether you come get it or it's served to you, whatever, he doesn't tell us how to do that in here.
None of that's in there. That's all just stuff that we've come up with.
And not that it's bad. It's just, but you can't look at it and go, oh, look, he has little tiny cups and little tiny styrofoam crackers. That's how we have to do it. And so you can't look at it that way. We need to look at things through an eternal lens of what is it that he's revealing about the character and nature of God, of Jesus, of the Trinity. And that's where we get.
That's what he's doing in here. So it's going to sound like we're bashing the Lord's Supper, how we do it traditionally, at least in the
Protestant.
Yeah,
we're not Presbyterian.
In the Protestant type religion. That's, if you're a Baptist, you're a Protestant. And not, but we won't get into
Anyways,
the conversation.
Stay the course.
So I started wondering about, okay, so we've been talking about Paul and who he is, and he's just a man and all that. He was a Hebrew, and he was a Levite, and we all know his past. He was a Mr. Zealot for what he had, and I think he was genuine in that. But he starts talking about the Lord showed me.
Yeah.
Now, he was talking about them coming to church and having dinner, and we just presumed they were doing the Lord's Supper. I think they were just having fellowships of sorts, but they were coming in to contend and show what their place was what they were doing.
Yeah.
So that's how it reads. You come here and there's going to be divisions amongst you because you're jockeying for positions inside this culture right here so that you can be seen as the spiritual guy or whatever that is. I'm paraphrasing. And so he says, what you're doing is you're neglecting the people that are poor and that don't have. Mm-hmm. And, if you want to act like that, do it at home.
Well, he actually says in there, and we covered it in verse 20.
Yeah.
We haven't covered it yet. He says, when you come together, then it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. He's saying you can call it what you want to call it, but where you're honoring the Passover, whether you're doing it into that format, but because of the way your heart is and the way you're acting, jockeying for position, neglecting the poor, that's not the Lord's Supper.
You're not
remembering him.
That's exactly it. What I was getting at is that Paul was he wasn't one of the original 12 disciples.
Right.
And so he says in here, I'm going to tell you what the Lord told me that was. And you said something very significant there, that they came together, and whether they were doing Passover or whatever it was, and this church was not predominantly Hebrew. This was a mix of people. They probably had some Jews in there, but history was somewhat relevant back in those days. And so they could, well, we're going to do this because this is what God did with the same thing we do now. You know, Jewish holidays. We're going to celebrate some of those. Anyway, whatever it was that they were doing, they were trying to put the guise of church and spiritualism on top of it in terms of we're honoring God. And that's what he's doing. I mean, he's just going, that ain't what you're doing.
Right.
That may be what you're telling everybody you're doing, but that ain't what you're doing. And this is what the Lord showed me, that the Lord's Supper, he's referring back to what was transpiring, what was really going on from an eternal point of view. We don't see any of that from Paul or James or any of those guys in the New Testament. They don't address, because they were
Peter.
there.
You mean Peter?
Peter, yes, I'm sorry. They were actually there during that Lord's Supper when Jesus was there.
Right.
I don't even know if they picked up on it then, but certainly later when the Spirit came, I guarantee you they got a grasp of it. But they got a grasp of it from their traditional upbringing. I think that they got a grasp of the Jewish festivals and the feasts and those kind of things in a whole different perspective.
Well, and I think Solomon would tell you there's, or Ecclesiastes will tell us that nothing's new under the sun. And the problems he's dealing with in the church at Corinth, a very immature way, maybe that's even too heavy of a word, an incomplete way to look at them would be just to say that they were procedural issues.
Yeah, I'm not even trying to condemn them. We all go through
stuff
that they were doing.
But he was trying to dig into the much bigger eternal root things. Even in the text, verse 12, he says, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. So he's all the way back, going back to, look, remember, this is in the section that's in response to questions they had asked him.
Yes.
And he was kind of like, look, I don't really want to get into the specifics of all the junk, but since you asked, okay, fine. You can almost see him just kind of going, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Now let's address this one. You're asking me how you should do the Lord's Supper. And he's like, first of all, you almost can see him like take a deep breath, and he's like, listen, we can't even get to how you're doing the supper because the fact that when you come together, you're not in unity. And it's not even about being, unity is not conformity. You're not to be all the same, but it's unity of spirit. Yeah. And he says, because there's divisions. And then in verse 19, here's a big one. We're going to probably have to stop and talk about this. Indeed, it is necessary there be factions among you, so that those who are approved may be recognized among you.
So I don't know how you see that.
Well, why I see it's irrelevant. But
well, no, what I mean is his tone.
Yeah.
He's being very sarcastic when he says
I would agree with that.
Okay, yeah.
And here's the deal. I'm going to be careful. In John 17, Jesus prayed for unity. It's extremely important to him. It's the last thing he prayed for on his way out, that we would be one. Nazi Germany was also very unified. So unity for the sake of unity is short-sighted. Unity around...
Unity in the sake of conformity based off what somebody's telling you how you should do that.
Right, but unity of the Spirit around Christ and in Christ, that relationship of one with another, abiding and living, not just physically, but spiritually, and putting up with each other, that's what he's targeting. And he says in here, look, before we address the supper, we got to address the fact that you're not unified in your spirit, in your intent. You're not unified in your goals. You're not unified in your worship. And he's like, and frankly, There needs to be, because that's the only way we're gonna identify those of you who do not have eternal lenses on. That's what he says. That's how we can tell who's approved and who's not.
Yeah.
And the language there literally means there kind of needs to be some friction from time to time, because that's how we can tell who's really pursuing Christ and who's pursuing religiosity or legalism, because the roots of these questions are, tell us what to do and what not to do. And he's like, you're missing the point. The Pharisees always wanted to know, what's the law say? What's the law say? What's the law say? And Jesus came in and just flipped that up and was like, the law is incomplete, you know? And he would just do stuff all the time on purpose to jack that up. Kind of the same thing here. He was like, these divisions are not, he was very sarcastic, but he's kind of saying, I hate that there's divisions, but at least they're showing me who's got a genuine heart or not. And I don't think we can lose sight of that. Sometimes a little friction will actually get us refocused. You know?
Yeah. No, and there's going to be friction.
Right.
That's all over the Old and the New Testament.
And then, so then he goes on and he says, and he's talking about, where is it? Indeed, it's necessary so that we can tell who those are. Verse 20, when you come together, then it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That's what we were talking about. Because of the fact that you're not coming with the right heart, and I don't mean like you're perfect. He's just like, your goals are just jacked up. Your heart's not in the right place. Not like everything's confessed. No, not necessarily. He's just saying that the function of what you're doing is off.
Well, specifically before that, what he's saying is you're coming in here to be seen.
Exactly. And
whoever's seen the most is the one that carries the weight, so to speak.
Which what impresses me about that is one could say you could do everything, quote unquote, just right with the Lord's Supper. You could have the right drink, the right cracker, the right method, the right everything. But if you're just coming in to be seen, then you're no longer taking the Lord's Supper. I don't know what you're doing, but it ain't the Lord's Supper. And because the Lord's Supper is literally about communing and with the Lord, proclaiming his death till he comes. And if you're doing it just to be seen, then you're actually negating the whole purpose of it, and you're not doing that anymore.
Well, when I say to be seen, I'm talking about that can either be literal,
or by God even,
or it could be to be seen as right, right in the Lord, or just right in your own what you want to prevail and how it is that you want to be seen and taken. And also when he talks about unity in the terms of the Spirit functions in that, is, are you coming in just to prove that everybody else is wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, any of those are what that is.
Well, and again, I don't want to get too deep into, because if you approach the end of 1 Corinthians 11 again with how should we do the Lord's Supper, you're going to actually miss the exegetical purpose, the actual purpose and intent of the passage. This passage is not to tell you what size cup to use. It's not there to tell you which cracker you should use, or how, or even if you should dip or you should not dip, because we have all these traditions. What he's addressing there is look, your motives are what's at question here.
Yeah.
It's a check of the heart in what you're doing. I was leading a congregation in the Lord's Supper a few weeks ago, and I use the term sometimes I grew up with. That doesn't always necessarily mean that I was taught things.
Yeah.
It means just a lot of times I gleaned on my own accord from things, and wrongly so. That if I had any unconfessed sin in my life, even willfully or by ignorance, I just didn't know, and I took the Lord's Supper, that there was going to be some catastrophic, because he says down here, talking about y'all taking it. He talks about it later on about some of you are sick and are dead because of it, and that freaked me out. And not to minimize that, but the way I internalized that was if I got the method wrong, that he was going to blow me up. But what he's targeting here is what's your heart and your motive for it.
Yeah.
Why are you taking this? And even when he gets into the language later on about some of you are sick and have died because of your abuse of this thing. It's not because they took the cup before the bread out of order, or they had too big a piece or too little. I mean, it's not anything like that.
Yeah.
It was because their motive and their heart was not looking into the face of God.
Yeah.
It was because they had a motive to be seen, or for whatever the thing. It was something different. And he says that language, you're not even doing the Lord's Supper. I don't know what you're doing. Don't you have homes to go to? Because what you're really doing now is you're just eating. Because of the motive of your heart, you're not even taking the Lord's Supper. You're just having a snack.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so their heart actually diminished the importance and the significance of the action. And so in that sense, yeah, check your heart. And he talks about self-examination in the last part of this chapter, you know, and that is important. But I guess my caution, my encouragement is don't get so hung up on, do we have the right cup? Do we have the right bread? Do we do it, you know, in the right fashion, as much as is what is it that I'm trying to communicate from my heart? And I think of it as, I guess you'd call it a vision one time, but as an artist, I see things in my mind a lot. That's just how I think visually.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to tell whether or not I just had a thought or whether it was the Lord speaking to me. I don't know. But I had this, and one of these days I'm going to draw this picture, but I had this thought. It was during communion. We were taking Lord's Supper, and I was in prayer, and I just saw this face of this kind of a disheveled guy. Hair was kind of wild, little Middle Eastern looking, you know, Israeli guy. And he was holding a cup like this out to me. And I had this profound sense that everybody in the room was sitting across a tiny table, one-on-one with Jesus, having coffee or something, having an intimate conversation around the supper, around the table, the cup and the bread. And that's the way it felt, was like, I really want to commune with him. You know, he's offering me this, and when I take it, I'm receiving him, I'm accepting him, I'm proclaiming his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And when that's in your heart of what you're doing, the methodology becomes far less important.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is you can have all the methodology correct and your heart screwed up, and then you're not even doing the Lord's Supper anymore, regardless of your liturgy. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And everything that Paul's telling them all through Corinthians right here, and he hits on that here. The reason he tells them all this is it's not about the method with which you do it. And we get wrapped around the axle on that, everything that you just said. But the Lord's Supper is a picture of something where he took the cup.
Yeah.
And he broke the bread.
Yeah.
And he gave it out. And the semblance of that is that the Creator himself, you don't have it until he gives it to you.
Right.
John the Baptist looked at his own disciples when they were like all over him about how it ought to be going and why they all going over there. And he just dead tells them, you can receive nothing unless it is given to you by
That's right.
heaven.
That's right.
And I'm sure that was an answer that just, they were like, what's that got to do with what we're talking about?
Everything.
That's exactly what these people are doing right now.
Yeah.
And Paul in his whole conversation is trying to tell them, stop looking at that and look here. Don't look at your ministry. Look at him.
Yeah.
And all the things living will come out of that.
Yeah.
That's the picture here.
Well, and I think that's
hard for us to grasp.
It is, but I think the admonition is, and I'll, you know, to wrap up, even looking back at Eli's service and his life, I hope no one ever has to put together a memorial service for one of your children. But there was a profound sense of what can I offer? I mean, anytime I've done hundreds of funerals, probably, I don't know how many. And every time you sit down and you get your piece of paper out and you're thinking, what can I offer the family? What can I offer the friends and the people there, you know, for comfort and hope and those things? I was profoundly aware, you know, at Eli's service, I don't have anything to give except that which has been given to me. And can I turn around and give it? Sure. But when I take the supper, when I take the cup and the deal, it's an intentional cognitive decision to frame it in such a way. It's not just I'm taking the cup, it's I'm receiving the cup. I'm receiving the bread, like you just said. And it's a subtle twist, but it's a profound one. That we are receiving from the Lord. He even says in there, what I received from the Lord, I've given to you. That's what he says at the beginning of that section about the Lord's Supper. And it's important to keep in our minds that as we take the Lord's Supper, that literally is what we're doing. We're receiving salvation. We're receiving blessing from him, partaking in his death and burial, his brokenness, and proclaiming that he died because of his own volition. You know, it pleased the Father to crush him for our sake. And instead of this, how do we take it properly? The shift is I just want to receive it.
It pleased the Father to crush him.
That's a whole different podcast.
Well, it is. But it may seem kind of weird that he might say something like that. The Father was pleased to crush Christ. He did it because he didn't want to crush you.
That's right.
That's what had to happen, or there would have been no creation left.
Well, in wrestling
That's
with
profound stuff.
You know, I said at Eli's funeral, and it was just one of those profound things I think the Spirit gave me, and it hit me in my prep, was we always want to search for meaning and purpose behind everything. And the reality, whether we like it or not, whether I would change it or anything, because I would, honestly, I would change it. But the reality is that through his passing, as tragic as it was, some lives were touched and some gospel seeds were sown that might not have been sown otherwise. And who am I? Who are we to say, not mine? Who would Abraham have been to say, not Isaac? It could be anybody but Isaac. When the Lord himself, God the Father, didn't say, you can have anything but Jesus. It frames everything a little differently.
Yeah.
And so when I look into 1 Corinthians, talking about the Lord's Supper, it frames it differently to me. It brings me into a place of understanding that you really gave up everything for me. You did.
Yeah.
You gave up your only son so that I could hear the gospel and receive it. And I just think that there are people out there today that have heard the gospel because of this situation, even with Eli. And I have to grasp that and hang on to the fact that there's hope in that.
Yeah.
That there's goodness in that. As tragic as it is, as torn up as we are, doesn't change the outcome. And so I'm looking for Romans 8:28. You know, how do all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose? Yeah. And I think that's how. But as I get to the Lord's Supper, I'm just like, you know, let's reframe it into how should we do this and make sure we get it right so that God doesn't blow us up, and just reframe it into, look, just check your heart at the door and just come receive something from him. Don't check your mind, check your heart.
Yeah.
And that. Before we wrap up, I do want to encourage you. We've got a giveaway going right now. $120 retail worth of material, study material, a genuine leather Bible going to somebody. We'll have a drawing at the end of the month. The way you enter it is you go to our Facebook page. Well, first of all, you go to Google Play Store, go to the App Store, download our app. It's called the Crucibles Fire. Install it. Take a screenshot of it after it's installed and post that picture. If you go to my Facebook page, Matt Parker, there's a pinned post of the contest. Just go to the comments and post your picture on there and of your installation. I'll put you in the drawing. I don't know how many, we got quite a few actually. And but through that app, you can access all of our online material, all of our training material, both written and stuff digital. There's a store on there where you can get digital copies of our publications. You can get print copies. All of our videos and stuff are on there from YouTube and Spotify. All of that stuff's on there, and some stuff that we don't really talk about a lot, but it's on there. So do that. Enter yourself into the drawing, and then share that. Get all your friends involved. We sure would appreciate it. What do you got before we go?
You said it all.
Wow, can somebody put that on record? Anyway, glad y'all are here. Glad to be back. Lord willing, we'll be back next week and continue the podcast. See, I forgot I'm doing the podcast today. Sean's not here, so I got to remember to turn it off. We'll see y'all later.
Bye now.
All right, bye-bye.